Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining from. I'm with Stanford's Doerr School of Sustainability, and I have been part of the founding team that's designed the Global Sustainability Challenge. We are very excited about the session today and about having you all participate in the challenge. I have my colleague Bharti with me, who's also going to be presenting with me today. So, Bharti, quick introduction from you, and then we can get started.
Thank you, Nidhi, and welcome everyone. I'm Bharti. I'm from Himachal in India. I'm also an alumnus of Stanford. I've worked in the policy space a little bit, also founded a startup that worked closely in the Indian policy ecosystem. Very excited to have you all join the session today and to talk about ways to bridge innovation and influence through policy.
All right, Bharti, shall we get started? Wonderful. We can then get started with going into the challenge guidelines. And I'll tell you briefly about the challenge and the guidelines, but I'd encourage all of you to really take a look at our website, which has a lot more detail. We are a consortium of universities around the world that have come together to put together this challenge. This is our inaugural year, and the challenge is designed for university students around the world. It does not matter which academic discipline you are studying in, you can participate. You could be an undergrad student, a grad, or a PhD student, and you can team up with others and join the challenge. What we are looking for is really you thinking about the problems in your context and building real world and impactful solutions. The challenge proceeds in 3 phases. We are in the first phase right now. It's where you are really thinking about your problem statement, defining it, and researching and designing your solutions. We go on till November with this phase, and then we come to build. Solutions are evaluated, and then we get to build. In build, you're developing, testing, and iterating your solutions. You're showcasing them at regional finals, which will happen between mid-January and mid-February in multiple cities around the world. And then in phase 3, which begins about February and then goes on till April, you will refine your solutions. You will come and showcase them at the global finale. April 29th, we will have the global finale in Munich at the Technical University of Munich. During phase 3, you are really just improving your solution based on the feedback that you've received, and you're improving your pitch. So that's how the challenge proceeds. There are evaluation criteria for each phase. The criteria remains the same, and they're all listed out in detail, in a lot of detail on our website. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the website, which I'm going to very quickly paste in chat for everyone. So if you haven't yet gone to the website and explored all the tabs on the website, I'd encourage you to go through the project guide, go through the resource library, which is very rich with resources. And if you're trying to find inspiration for ideas or trying to understand more about 2 of our inaugural themes, you can take a look at resources there. Over to you, Bharti.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nidhi. So we're going to get started with our agenda for today. As Nidhi mentioned, we are going to talk about the need for policy and awareness related solutions. What are pathways that one can take to enable those? Give you some inspiration for things that students and youth have done across the world. Talk a little bit about challenge guidelines for the policy and awareness solutions. And in the end, we also have a chance for you to meet each other, meet fellow participants who are working on various problems. As you can see, we have a very global audience, so we hope that you'll also get to learn from each other. And then we'll save some time in the end for questions. So with that, I am going to get started. with a very quick poll for you all again, which is, according to you, what percentage of emission reduction that is needed by 2050 for net zero can be achieved with technologies that are already available, so technologies that have already been developed or innovated? And we have four options, so less than 1/3, which means a lot of innovation still needs to happen for net zero, or approximately half, or 2/3, or almost all, if you think that all of the policy, all of the technologies that are needed have been developed. So this is great. I think we're in the right ballpark. The number is about 65%. So 2/3, approximately 2/3 of the solutions that we actually need to achieve net zero have been developed in the world, but they've not been deployed, which means there are still things that need to happen beyond just technology innovation for those solutions to be available for everyone to use and actually achieve net zero. There are still 35% of the CO2 emission sources which do need innovation. So this is by no means to say we don't need innovation. We do need a lot of that, but we also need ways to deploy things at scale. And of course, innovation is going to help us reduce the cost for some of the solutions that are already there. So that being said, this is where the role for policy and behavior change comes in. So if technologies are already there, why aren't we using them? According to IPCC, you do need the right policies, the infrastructure, and then the technology in place to enable people to shift their lifestyle, shift their behaviors, shift how they are emitting today, and that can really achieve the greenhouse gas reduction that we need. And there are three ways to do that, or three layers in which you can think about it. The first one is public awareness and engagement. So you can get people to be more aware about what are their actions, how can their actions influence both their emissions, but also maybe their cost savings or their access to resources. You can think of having economic and financial incentives, and you can think of having some policies which can range from encouraging guidelines to laws that can actually enable adoption of technologies that have already been developed. So let's dig deeper into what all of this means. And we want you to think about this in different layers. So you don't necessarily need all the policy and all the laws to be enacted at the global or the national level. You can actually start with an individual and then go from the individual to your community, to your town or city, to your district or county, state, and maybe even your entire nation. And there are definitely youth as who've also tried to enable action at the global level. So that's also not off limits for this challenge. So let's take some examples of how would public awareness and engagement work. So say at an individual level, you could encourage behavior change and nudges that can help people reduce their resource usage or change their diet. In your own household, maybe you can have rules that encourage people to, say, dispose of their waste properly. And if they don't do that, have a punishment mechanism, right? I do plan to implement that in my household soon. So similarly, you can go to different levels, right? You can have programs at a community level for water saving. You can have things at your university where you're encouraging people to, say, save water. You can use education and media. There have been people who've developed county-wide environmental curricula for schools that schools do need to teach students about environmental challenges, or you could have local public transportation promotion in your town, county, or district. And then at a national and global level, information and awareness can have a huge role to play. One could build a way for people to track products' sustainability before they buy it. So all of these are great examples of how you can enable public awareness and engagement without actually changing any laws, without getting into the legal or the taxation ecosystem. The next layer is having the economic and financial incentive. So you could ideally encourage people to be more sustainable by providing them certain monetary incentives. They can also range from different levels. We will, in the interest of time, not go into all of these examples today, but I want you to think about all the things that you could do by using money and financial incentives as a leverage. These slides will be made available to all of you through the resource library, so you can always go back and look at these examples there. And then, lastly, we'll talk about policy and governance, where we're not providing an incentive, but we're making either a guideline or a regulation or a standard or a code for people to adhere to. And again, these can be local, but these can also be global. So you could have local building codes in your area to make your houses more climate resilient. You could have emission standards at the national level. And again, various examples exist across the world. And on that note, since we do have a very global audience, if you had a magic wand to enact any policy or any behavior change that you could in the world, obviously sustainability related, what would it be? There's no wrong answer for sure. Okay, we have Parul and Nidhi who both think alike and have decided to set a carbon price. Michael is for afforestation. That is amazing. Mohammed, you want to help stop gas emissions. Less non-vegetarian per capita allowance for Adit. Oh, great. We have more people for the carbon pricing, but Abir wants to eliminate single-use plastic. Pemfero, you want to work on methane reduction. That is amazing. Methane is one of the very potent greenhouse gases. These are such brilliant ideas, and I wish we could implement all of them right now. We're going to try and do a very quick summary of this. Looks like obviously we want to promote afforestation, reduce methane, look at waste management and lifestyle changes. So we seem to have covered everything. And our most popular opinion is, as predicted, setting a carbon price. So now that you have all of these ideas, how wonderful would it be if you could go ahead and implement it? And I'm sure you must be wondering, we're still in university. How are we going to do this? And you'll be surprised to know that when policymakers think about regulations, or when people also think about what do they need to do to be more sustainable, hearing people who do need to inherit this planet, which is your generation and the generation that comes after you, makes a lot of difference. A university student who is very determined to save their planet and their home for their future, because ultimately all the policies and regulations related to sustainable development are for the future generation. So we wanted to start out your role by telling you that you actually have the power to influence change. And if you can come together, come up with a great plan and make the representations to your policymakers or to your community, they will listen to you. But let me not just say this, but give you some examples. Across the world, youth have united in various forms and asked for sustainability related action. To give you some examples, in the European Union, a group of teenagers actually went to court to ask the EU to withdraw from a fossil fuel support treaty. In Indonesia, Climate Rangers, which is again a youth-led organization, arranged a political awareness campaign to make people as well as the politicians aware about the impacts of climate change. In Bangladesh, a group of youth actually enabled community awareness and action for saving water and using good quality water. And in the US, group of youth organized a virtual reality run to help people understand the impact of building dams on the local salmon population. So as you can see, there are various ways to take action, and all of these can have a very positive impact for the society. So we'll encourage you to look at some of these examples, get inspired by these, and start working on your ideas for the challenge. We'll jump into what would it take for it to be a good deliverable for the Global Sustainability Challenge, since you all are here for that. But it's probably the actions that you take will not be limited to Global Sustainability Challenge, but will create impact for your community and the planet. But for the challenge, in phase one, which is the Ignite phase, we want you to go really deep into the problem statement, especially to establish why a policy or an awareness solution is a good idea. We would want you to do your research, which is understand what's the current status of your community or your region, what are global examples, what has been tried elsewhere, what's worked, what's not worked. We would want you to make a very detailed stakeholder map, since any of this change cannot happen without having the right stakeholders on board. So you want to figure out who needs to agree for this change to happen, but you also want to anticipate who might oppose this change, because you will always find people who will not like this change, and you want to be aware of that and find ways to address that. And then for phase one, what we would need in terms of the proposed solution is maybe like the draft policy or the awareness campaign. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you need to have a well thought through draft. And then some calculation on the feasibility, whether it is legally feasible or financially feasible, depending on what your solution is, and have a cost benefit with estimated impact for the society. So that's for phase one. We know it's in 3 weeks, but we do think you can get to this in phase one, because it is mostly about thinking and talking to people. In phase two is when you do start to build. And now you'll wonder, what's a prototype for a policy, right? It's not there's no physical product, there's no code we have to write. So in this case, your prototype can be that you actually went and made a formal representation to the policymakers, to the stakeholders that you had identified in phase one, that, look, here is the problem. This is what we think is a good, either a policy or a community level solution. And this is why we think you should enact this, and give them the legal framework. So a prototype can be a copy of the formal representation you made, or if you've launched a public awareness campaign, then launching that public awareness campaign. The phase two also requires you to test your product and get feedback from the users. So feedback in this case could be a feedback from the policymakers, who could say that, oh, look, this is what is not okay in the policy, this would need to change, or this is not feasible. So they could provide you with that feedback. If you're doing a public awareness or media campaigns, then you would have engagement numbers from who engaged and who did not, and what was their response. And you can summarize all of this in your 5-minute pitch. And then lastly, in phase three is your time to shine, which is you will use all the feedback that you received, refine your solution. You will have your presentation at the global finale. We do not expect for the scope of this challenge that you will actually have changed regulation in your region. But if you do, that will also be amazing. But we don't want you to be conservative about your ambition. The goal is not to change regulation in 6 months. That's possibly very difficult to do, but some people have. But actually to go through the process, help identify the stakeholders, establish what needs to be done, and make people who are going to make this change aware about the change. So with this, we're gonna dive into an example, and I just want to make sure there are no questions.
There's one, Bharti, about stakeholder mapping and possibly a template for policy. And I know we're talking about stakeholder mapping in just a bit. And then there's a comment from Amit about what we could be doing as policies. So I think, which is great. It's examples of,
Great.
Yeah, it's examples at various levels.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Okay, so Let's dive into what would be a good deliverable for phase one. And so let's start with this one problem statement. So we're going to pick up the problem statement of peak energy demand. I'm assuming most of you would know that renewable energy is one of the critical ways in which we will get to net zero emissions. This is within our theme of sustainable energy. But renewable energy is intermittent. So the sun doesn't shine all 24 hours, the wind doesn't blow all the time. And this intermittence can sometimes lead to overproduction of energy during some hours of the day and underproduction during others. At the same time, our consumption of energy as human beings is also not consistent throughout the day. We consume more energy during certain hours, especially in the evenings when people usually come back from work. There is a huge spike in energy consumption that happens. And this leads to what's called a duck curve. So if you see the graph on the right side, you can imagine it looks like a duck, the beak on the right side, the tail on the other, and a belly in between. And as we add more renewable energy to the grid, this belly basically becomes fatter and fatter. So your duck curve is getting deeper. Now, one way to solve this is obviously to add energy storage, right? You could add energy storage and you could store energy during the day and use it in the evening, but energy storage is not cheap as of yet. That innovation still needs to happen. At the same time, there's another way to reduce this, which is to shift the peak, which is occurring in the evening, or in different regions, the peak might be occurring at different times. People could be encouraged to shift the peak. Some people might just agree to shift the peak. So if you're coming home, say you come home and you start your laundry, like you start your washing machine, you might be encouraged to delay that start. If you have an electric vehicle, you come and plug your electric vehicle, you might be encouraged to delay charging your electric vehicle in the evening. Now, for that, technologies do exist. Home battery storage, virtual power plants, but they're not adopted because of lack of awareness. This is where you could come in. For your region, you could understand your local context, see what's being done today, figure out who are the stakeholders who need to enact this change, figure out what could be intervention pathways, what would a good change look like. It could be in terms of having pricing for different pricing for different hours of the day, which is called time of day pricing. It could be encouraging people to buy home energy storage systems, buy batteries. It could be related to finding out if there are industries who use a lot of energy in the evening and if they could shift their loads during the day. So different intervention pathways exist and you would need to explore them. Then you would need to brainstorm and see what would work for your region. The brainstorming will involve some iteration to figure out, do we use some behavioral economics? Do we use nudge theory? And then you can go to the resource library and find some of the resources about all of these. Then you would need to check for feasibility, both legal feasibility. So if you want to implement a tariff change, does your region actually allow it? And technical feasibility. Does your grid have smart meters for you to actually know when people are using energy and implement time of day pricing? So you would have to do that at your end to then again iterate and come up with a solution and then evaluate impact. And on the right side, we've given you a rough stakeholder map of who are the people who would want to maybe be supportive and then someone could be opposing this. And to Abir's question of how do you identify who are all the stakeholders, one good way is to actually start from once you've decided what your change is, who needs to agree for this change to happen, who are all the people who are involved in making the change happen, and then thinking of who is this change going to impact. So in this case, we know that if this change needs to happen, your state regulators need to say yes. Now, if we take the example of changing the tariff, your state regulators need to say yes. Your energy utility companies need to say yes because they will be the ones who will have to manage the changing loads. Your technology providers need to say yes because they will have to provide the smart meters or the batteries that are needed. Your homeowners, people who are going to be impacted by this, will also need to agree to this change in some way because you're going to change their pricing. The second thing you need to also think about is who is going to be impacted by it, both positively and negatively. So if this change is implemented, environmental groups will be happy because you're using more renewable and you're enabling that to happen. Some large business owners might be happy if they're getting cheaper electricity during the day. Small business owners who might not have as much flexibility might not be happy because their pricing will change. Fossil-based power producers will surely not be happy because they will now produce less. So this could be a good way to think about who the stakeholders are. Another layer could also be to think about who's going to influence the people who are deciding and the people who are opposing. And some of that can be media, which we don't have here. Similar to environmental groups, there might be some pro-consumer advocacy groups who might unite people. So thinking about it in layers, which is who needs to make the change, who does the change impact, and then who might influence the change makers, could be a good way to map your stakeholders.
Wonderful. Glad you like the example. And I think you asked about the stakeholder mapping. And as Bharti said, you can add layers. You could even do a 2 by 2 where you're saying that so the people who support versus oppose, and then on the other axis, you could talk about influence, and then finally look at people who have the highest influence and who support it. Those could be the first set of people you approach, and also people who oppose it very strongly but have a very high impact, right? So you've got to actively work with them. There is a
I
question
think, Nidhi,
about who are stakeholders. Do you want to very quickly answer that, Bharti, and then we'll get to the breakout rooms
yes, who
in
are
the chat?
stakeholders and how do you get meetings with them? Mohammed, to your question, who are stakeholders? It's basically the broad sense, anyone who's going to either play a role in enabling your change or disrupting your change, right? So it can be people who are responsible for either changing the policy or making your community more aware or creating this, say, tax incentive that needs to be implemented. It is also people who are impacted by this change, right? So stakeholders aren't only people who will make the change, but you also need to think about people who will be impacted by the change and how they might react to your change, which will include your, say, in the example we took, it could include the homeowners or the residents who will have to pay the different tariff, different electricity prices. It will include people who are whose products might get sold, or it'll also include people whose products sales will stop. So that is stakeholders. And then to Adit's question on once I'm done with the stakeholder map, how do I get meetings with these government stakeholders? That's probably the most difficult part, to be honest, which is how do you get people to listen to you? And you will have to try various strategies to do this. One obviously simple way is to, since you are students, you can send a letter collectively to these stakeholders and be like, this is what we want to discuss about, and we want a meeting with you. It might work, it might not work. Your letter might just be ignored. If it is, then you need to figure out what are the channels in which they can be influenced. One way is to go talk to some, say, environmental groups that might be already in touch with these stakeholders who might be able to take your representation to them. Another way could be, say, to go to your university president or director, and a lot of times the university president or directors would know the stakeholders. Another creative way to do it is to organize an event and invite one of the government stakeholders that's important for you as the chief guest. They like to show up, and then you can be like, this is what we want you to do. So you can be very creative about how you want to influence the stakeholders, but it is an important question.
There is another question. Michael, your question is, suppose the idea is expensive, should we bother about the costs? It would be nice if you can think about the costs and do that calculation and show us how you are thinking about the costs, how are you arriving at them? Because ultimately, a solution, when you have to implement it, you do have to think about its feasibility, including financial feasibility, and you have to do some cost benefit analysis because there are always multiple solutions to solve a problem and you're trying to see which one is most feasible in a particular setting. We would recommend that you do think about it. I know we're at the top of the hour. We have a lot of FAQs on our website and a lot of resources as well. So if you'd like to check those out, please feel free. And again, reach out to us if you have any questions that have not been answered. Thank you to everyone for joining.